So we heard General Crawford talk about the race for talent. I've used the term fight for talent, but I couldn't agree with him more. There's a couple of things that are interesting to consider. You know, we have a low unemployment rate in the country today. The unemployment rate for cyber talent is 0. So it's a factor that we need to consider as we address this particular issue. A couple of statistics for the enlisted force currently. I just picked this up from the recruiting command. It's, you know, we know that only 3 in 10 or just a few under 3 in 10 young people qualify to join the Army today, broadly, when you consider all of the demands that we ask for, all of the requirements that we have out there. It's actually 2 in 10 for those that are able to demonstrate the qualifications and the attributes for some of the cyber skills that we're looking for. So that just kind of gives you an indication or some more validation of what we probably already know. General Ham has introduced General McGee, so I won't go over that again. I'd like to introduce also on the panel Mr. Brett Barraclough. He is the Executive Director of Cyber and Information Solutions and Services Group at ManTech. He's an executive level program and portfolio manager there with 20 years of experience. He's a lead for all cybersecurity related opportunities, and his areas of expertise include programs focused on defensive cyber operations, biometric technologies, force protection, and global positioning systems. Next, we have General Hernandez. Most of you know him as the first commander of Cyber Command, already taken to task, I think, for some of the evolutions that we've had as he launched us on that journey there as the commander of Army Cyber. He was the Army's lead for cybersecurity activity and responsible for cyber doctrine training and leader development while he was there. He currently serves as the West Point Cyber Chair to the Army Cyber Institute, and he's on a wide range of advisory boards. He serves as a faculty member of the National Association of Corporate Directors, and he speaks to boards about their role in overseeing cybersecurity. He's a cyber expert on leadership, human capital, cyber threats, strategic planning, and enterprise risk management. Next, and this goes to my comments about moderating this august body, Mr. Chris Olexia from the NSA. I have no information about him. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris to share what he would like to share.
Like I said earlier, it's not an accident, sir. My name is Chris Olexia. I'm the Chief of External Recruiting and Hiring at the National Security Agency. And the reason there's no bio, that was a bit of a late addition to today's consortium, so I'm thrilled to be here. I appreciate it. So I'm going to talk a bit about how I have the responsibility of designing and developing our recruiting and hiring strategy every year. So this past year, our target was a little bit less than 2,000, and of that, the STEM, about 44% of those 2,000 make up STEM personnel that we're seeking to attract. So look forward to talk to you a little bit more about how we do our very best to meet that goal.
And thanks, Chris. And just so you know, I asked him if it was okay if we teased him a little bit before we got started, because I didn't want to expose myself to too much risk from the NSA after I left here today. Next we have Mr. Alan Paller. Most of you know him as the founder of SANS, a professional cybersecurity training school, and we just saw some of the expertise in the focus areas that they are involved with. And we know him as also the president of the SANS Technology Institute. He oversees a global program that identifies and celebrates people responsible for the improvement in cyber risk reduction and chairs the annual RSA keynote panel on the 7 most dangerous new attack vectors. He's testified in front of the Senate, the House, and he was a initial member of the President's National Infrastructure Assurance Council. And last, Tim Petit is a principal at Booz Allen Hamilton. He has more than 33 years combined active duty defense and consulting experience, covering many aspects of military communications, joint and combined exercises, and cyberspace operations. Following his career in the Army Signal Corps, he joined Booz, where he's been there for 12 years. He's currently aligned to the Booz cyber account, where he leads the firm's business across DoD cyberspace operations. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to turn the floor over to our panel chair, and then we'll begin our remarks.
Okay, well, good morning, everybody.
Yes,
Thanks. Yeah, already technologically, hindered. So I'm JP McGee. I'm now the director of the Talent Management Task Force for the Army. But for the last 2 years, I've been the Deputy Commanding General for Operations for Army Cyber. And one of my responsibilities given to me when I first took over the job from General Cardone, then the commander of Army Cyber, was to start moving out with the talent management of the cyber force that we have. And it's been significantly interesting, and I've learned a tremendous amount. So if you want, I will start off with a couple framing thoughts on talent management writ large and why sometimes this is difficult and challenging. Then I'll speak specifically about some of my observations from within the cyber force and some of the things that we've been doing to try to get ahead of this. So, the way the academia and the Army looks at talent management is there are 4 pillars to it. It's acquire, develop, employ, and retain. And so getting a common definition for talent management is always a little bit challenging because everybody uses this term interchangeably, but it really encompasses all of those different activities. And I think some of the things that I've learned, and I think this is true in the world of Army Cyber, but it's also true to the Army as a whole, and that is, it is really, really difficult to ask an organization that is operating at full capacity to simultaneously do that function and then become tremendously innovative about bringing in new approaches. And so while working with our G1s, both of whom were of high quality, it became apparent, I think, to General Naxoni and to me that we needed an external organization that could bring in some good ideas, figure out how to implement them, and then hand them over to the G1 for their actual execution. But if we kept on asking the G1 of Army Cyber to continue to make these changes, it just added to a list of things that they were already consumed with, like pay and leave and bringing people in and all the things that the G1s across the Army do. And it wasn't really fair to ask them or possible for them to do both of those things. And so what we developed was an external construct working directly for me that was helping to drive some of those changes. And what we arrived in this 2-year-long process is what we need to do is sort of innovate and see these ideas, test them out, find out how they'd be implemented, do that in conjunction with the G1, and eventually hand that over to the G1. So it was done collaboratively and not just us telling them what to do. But it is hard to do within any large organization. The other thing that I think was interesting and often pretty amusing is that people don't like to change. Okay, they may be uncomfortable with stuff, but for people to actually change significantly is tremendously uncomfortable. So as I wandered around Army Cyber and talked to different groups of soldiers, I mean, the enlisted soldiers were sure that the current management system was going to be ineffective and it needed to be changed. The warrant officers were absolutely certain that the Army would never be responsive. The officers were absolutely convinced that the Army system was broken and could never support them. But then every time I suggest a fundamental change to the way the officers were managed, they'd say, whoa, hey, listen, you didn't want to change my stuff. I thought we were going to change warrant officers and enlisted. Warrant officers were very interested to see fundamental changes done to the officer corps, but not so much to the warrant officer corps. And so, because all of a sudden the constructs that people have grown up with have changed, and all of a sudden the idea of direct commissioning officers in as majors and lieutenant colonels, there's a whole cadre of lieutenant colonels and majors who have been working pretty hard for that in the Army for the last 10 to 12 years, and that puts that at risk. And so you've got to understand, I think, as you do any of these things with talent management, if you really want to change things, people are going to be more resistant to it than you thought. And so the idea of change is great until it impacts you, and then it changes things, and people get a little bit defensive. I think the other thing, and this was brought up to me by one of the civilians we got in to help us work with talent management at Army Cyber, and that was we've got to look at both sides of the equation in terms of there's a lot of talk about bringing in high-end tech talent who can really add a lot to the force and create greater operational effectiveness, and I think that's exactly right. But then the force needs to be ready to absorb that talent, because we can bring in 10 highly skilled engineers from Silicon Valley, we can direct commission them as majors, and after 4 years, if their experience has been, they spent a year waiting for a security clearance, and they spent another year before anyone would listen to them within the command, and what they come away with is exceptional levels of frustration dealing with that, then all of a sudden when they are talking back with their friends in Silicon Valley, no one else will want to do this. So it's not just about bringing in the people, acquiring them, it's also how we employ them, and that really starts coming to my next point, which is it is hard to talk about fundamental talent management change without hitting culture writ large. And so some of those things all need to change if we want to do it, because we've had a lot of focus on what we need to do differently to onboard new talent. I think that's appropriate. But then we've also got to make sure that the employment piece of that they're having these experiences that are enriching and valuable, and then all of a sudden a place like Army Cyber becomes the force of choice for people to come in and join if they're interested in some form of government service. But again, you can't do that at Army Cyber, or even I think across the Army. As I'm coming into this new job, it's interesting how when you really start pulling the threads on any of the significant initiatives we're discussing, you end up bumping into significant cultural issues with the way the Army has run that require some significant cultural change if we want to do that. Specifically to cyber operations and the cyber force, I think one of the things that I learned was the outsized contributions of people who are uniquely talented in technical skills. And so the physical domain does not have an analog to it. If you're a very good sniper, you can knock a target down at 1,000 meters. If you're an exceptional sniper, you can knock a target down at 1,400 meters. In the equivalent of this, if you're an exceptionally good coder, you're knocking down targets at 20,000 meters, because it's not bounded by physicality in the physical domain, it's in the virtual domain. And so these superstars, I think Mr. Peller calls them ninjas, they play an outsized role and an outsized contribution to our operations. And that's tough to get your head around if you're used to dealing in the physical domain. I think it helps support the initiative we're running right now to establish a technical track for cyber officers who are of that inclination, improve their ability to do that, where they can, after a certain point in their career, decide to stay on a technical track where they develop uniquely in that across an entire career, so they can continue to contribute. I think what I've seen is we're able to get tremendous support from Army senior leaders and Congress to make changes, but I think it's been hard sometimes for us to execute those changes as we actually start executing them as a force, because some of the things we are talking about is so fundamentally different and is a challenge to the way we've done things, and most people have grown up. So, one simple example, we have the ability to go to a hiring fair and offer a job to someone on the spot. Hey, you're talented. Hey, we screen you. We've got the system set up. But to actually put that into effect was a tremendous amount of work, and really changed a lot of people's mindsets about how we do the hiring process, which everybody complains about. But when you actually try to do it differently, fundamentally makes them relook the way we do this. So I think we can retain great soldiers. I think we can bring them. I think we can attract great civilians as well. And what you'll hear, I think, frequently is, how can you match industry with pay? And I think the fact of the matter is you can't. And so we need to stop even having that discussion. What we need, the way I look at it, and after talking to loads of people about this, is it's not a matter of matching civilian pay. It's closing the gap between military pay and civilian pay, and in that gap, providing all the things that keep all of us in service. So that's the sense of mission. That's the people that you work with. That's the uniqueness of contributing to your nation's defense that motivate all of us to serve long after there's not a financial incentive for you to remain in it. And I think that resonates with people much more than we sometimes give it credit. Now, I would argue we can't make that gap impossibly large. So we had one highly talented individual we wanted to bring in as a direct commission lieutenant. And when that individual looked at what he was going to make as a first lieutenant coming in through the direct commissioning program, he realized his pay was going to be equal to what he was being offered to work a part-time job at Dell. So we can't have it be that large of a gap. But if we can close that gap, and I think we're doing those things right now to make that happen with the assignment incentive pay, special duty assignment pay, and then the ability to bring some of this tech talent in, not as a first lieutenant, but as captains, majors, and lieutenant colonels, I think we've got some great opportunities to bring those people in. Because the other thing that I've learned is that there is a much larger desire for people to come and serve within the military, either as civilian or military, than we recognize. So two different conversations, two different times, both occurred in Silicon Valley. One was with a Stanford student who was in their computer science department who had done an internship at Army Cyber through a program that they have called Stanford in Washington. And at the end of it, on this panel at Stanford, he sort of gave me a hard time, and he said, look, he said, if you go to Stanford and you're in their computer science department, all they talk about is working for Facebook or Google or these other corporations. And there's this sort of idea of this sort of like garden environment that existing right here. He said, no one ever came and told me that there were opportunities for me to use my skills in the service of my country at a place like Army Cyber. He said, you guys, he pointed at me, have chosen not to compete in this market, and you're making a mistake by doing it because we don't even know these options exist because you don't make the trips out here to connect with us. So I thought that was pretty interesting. The other one was a gentleman who had worked for a number of years at Facebook. And he said, it's always funny dealing with the DOD and specifically with the Army because you come out here and you sort of like have to show up a hat in hand, and you sort of back up in these things. He said, your product is much more valuable and has much greater resonance with this tech workforce than you realize. It's a question of how you've presented it because it's going to tap into all the things that they want. They want to be part of a bigger sense of purpose. They want to be part of a special team. They want to contribute their skills, not just to get in an Uber, to a corner faster, but it's something that actually is impactful. And he said, what you guys lack is an effective marketing campaign to get that out there. Because if you did, you'd be surprised at what you find. I know I'm going a little over time. A couple other just observations and thoughts, but for the Guard and the Reserve, they've got a tremendously unique ability to help us out in this effort. So one, they can serve as our ambassadors to the civilian workforce, where we know much, but not all of the talent in this field resides. So our ability to use them as ambassadors and to use them as almost recruiting agents to bring people in is important. And the other piece that is really interesting about the Guard and Reserve is, if you're an infantry officer and you're in the Guard and Reserve, every day you're not on an activated status or training, you're losing readiness. For the cyber officers and the cyber soldiers who are there, they're actually probably gaining readiness and they're improving readiness because they're seeing what technology is occurring out in the civilian world, and they become the conduits for that to come back in. And just the final thoughts, when the current Vice Chief of Staff of the Army was the G1, he came to Army Cyber and he said that the cyber field is the petri dish by which the Army can look at these different talent management initiatives and how we can do it, because it's small and it's manageable and there's a lot of desire for change. And so as I go into this next job, I'm informed by what I've seen at Army Cyber as we look at applying some of these things across the entire Army, because I think cyber has everyone's attention, but we all know there are emerging fields that are coming up that are going to be determinative in terms of how we conduct land combat in the future, and a similar model on how we bring in experts in AI and robotics, biological warfare, all these different fields. I think it's not just cyber, it's much bigger than that. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, General McGee. Next, we're going to go to Mr. Barraclough.
Thank you, sir. Brett Barraclough just transitioned 2 years ago from ASALT out of the Army into ManTech Corporation. 50 years of ManTech, serving or securing the future. I had to say that in order to return to the office today. Now that's out of the way. We could just talk business and talk on a trusted relationship. How are we going to manage talent? I mean, that's really the issue. We're going back and forth, and is it a fight or is it a race? And I would say, look, if we're going to do this between industry and government, we have to share our strengths and we have to work hard. And if we follow those basic principles, we will be successful at putting the right people in the right places at the right time. What I'd like to talk about is just 4 different examples of things that I've seen as I transitioned from the military, went into the industry side, and I would say there's one notion that I'd like to dispel right now, that people will make all their decisions based on salary, based on money. That's not true. If that was true, General Fogarty wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have stayed in the Army for 30 years. Many of us would have gone and done things much earlier. We stayed in the service of our country because we think that's important. People that transition and then work and seek to have jobs where they continue to support the government have that same mission in their heart. Okay, they want to serve. So with that in mind, and they don't want to hurt the service that they came from. So let me just share a couple thoughts of what I've seen. One, tech leaders. What I've found is, in the past, I always thought that, your chief engineer, those guys, they weren't necessarily the good leaders. They weren't necessarily the visionaries. They liked their pet projects. They did their thing. And that's not what I saw as I went into government. What I saw was a group of individuals, many of which had been served as tank commanders in the Marine Corps, had served in combat arms missions across the entire spectrum of our formations. And now they're in cyber, and they were told, hey, you're a tech leader in this company. No one works for you. A program director will tell you at what point that you will go execute. And they were treated in some cases as a commodity. They didn't want that. And I think we started to lose the bubble on really building our tech leaders. What they wanted to do was find people they could mentor. They wanted small teams of high-performing individuals that they could bring along, because this learning experience is a process. It is an extended process. It's not, I got a certificate, I'm done. So what we found as we did that we had these different groups, and now we've started to move people together. And as we've been hiring, there was one interview that went on with one individual for 4 hours. That was going to be in a significant, important position for the company on the technical side. And what that person was really interviewing, the leader, that tech leader, was deciding, is this the next me? Is this the guy that I can train to take over my job? Okay? We should have that attitude throughout our military formations, throughout industry. That's what's going to attract talent. And not that we're in a competition with Google and Facebook, but at a certain point, people are going to make a decision on whether they're going to serve in government, support government, or just serve based on the commercial side. Well, I'd like to move now and talk about public and private synergy. I don't think it's a bad thing that we have companies that support both DoD, federal issues, and do some private issues, whether finance, community, et cetera. What I'm finding is that experience in those private domains will benefit the DoD. All learning is good. We're dealing with the same adversaries. We're dealing with the same techniques. So industry is able, I think, to bridge that gap between the public and private in a way that is very advantageous to the military. And I think we can also take a look as we set acquisition policy on how we're going to make awards, that we can really do things that help us keep talent. We can have longer periods of performance, so we can bring talented people in and guarantee them work for more than a year based on a base year type of period of performance. And also merit-based option awards. If a company's doing well, let them go ahead and have a decision on exercising an option far more than a month out, so we can retain a workforce and people don't start looking for jobs because they're just not sure if the job's going to be there a month from now. It's not a good way to run a quality workforce. Two other areas very quickly where I think that there's mutual support. We build multi-talented athletes, if you will, cyber athletes. Maybe that's a contradiction of term, cyber athlete. But at the same point, we have people that are very good in the offense, people that are very good in the defense. We form communities of practice. We're able to share information back and forth. And as we do that, I think that allows us to develop talent that can play both sides of the ball for those that are looking forward to football season. Lastly, I'd like to use one example of how industry has helped support the Cyber Protection Brigade and the cyber workforce in building up our DCO qualifications for the senior and master qualifications. Government Cyber Protection Brigade came to industry and said, hey, can you help us build out in certain areas in those 12 work roles that we've divided into 3 different major areas of system analysis, network analysis, and then data engineering and our cyber threat analysis. Help us build those work roles out, do that analysis. As we did that, we found as we went through that entire ITAR process, individual task analysis reports, what we thought was going to be about 300 different tasks grew to 600. We found that some of the new areas that we'd been looking at, such as data engineering and cyber threat analysis, had double the number of tasks of the other work roles in the other areas that had been more established. What does that mean? It means that I think we're mature. I think we're maturing in our individual tasks. I think that at this point, we're at a point now where we can move from just working individual tasks into the metal tasks and into what we need to do as far as our teams go. And I think there can be mutual support between government and industry as we do that also. It's about sharing strengths, and it's about hard work at this point. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Brett. Next, we're going to go to Mr. Olexia.
Good morning again. Yes, sir, it is. So a couple things I do want to highlight, and then I'll go into a little bit more granularity. So when it comes to, clearly it's a very competitive market. The better the economy is, the more competitive it becomes. Competition for the same talent is fierce. Having just said that, I can comfortably say that we attract enough talent to meet our mission requirements. When it comes to attracting that talent, there's a couple things to keep in mind. Know your brand. There needs to be some introspection. You need to know what your weaknesses are when it comes to perception. And I think that you need to work hard to eliminate any myths that are out there. So you need to be aggressive in understanding how you're perceived. That's something that we spend a lot of time and effort and understanding and knowing where we stand, not just in federal government, but when in comparing ourselves with private industry. For the most part, we're an industrial scale STEM hiring organization. We're not really competing with all that many federal entities. DHS has certainly ramped up, and we try to share as much of our findings through the years with them as possible. But we're very aware of what Facebook and Twitter and others out in California are currently doing. So I encourage you to know your brand, know how you are perceived. Maximize your reach. We try our very best to reach the nation's most underrepresented youth specifically. Dr. Powler can talk to this, or Mr. Powler can talk to this a little bit more. From our perspective, the good fortune that the state of Maryland and Virginia they have incredible high school institutions. Their public schools are fantastic. Not every state shares that privilege, and just the awareness, inspiring that next generation of potential cyber candidates. For us, that's a big thing. We work really hard to reach out across the country. We spend a lot of time in middle schools and high schools around the country. It's very much a national recruiting and hiring strategy, and we try our best to cultivate the message that this is out there and available, and that you are very capable of doing that. In line with that is the freedom to boldly innovate. Be fearless in your approach, and fear not that you may fail. From our perspective, we've been given that latitude to really poke and pry where others haven't, and some have succeeded and some have failed. But I can tell you that, for instance, as far as reaching out across the country, underrepresented youth, we developed the NSA Day of Cyber tool, where we've had over 5 million students that have pre-registered for that. We've had over 1,200 high schools declare NSA Day of Cyber Days, and it's nothing more than a career field trip. It's an innovative video. It's more of an awareness tool from our perspective, just to just let people know that these possibilities exist. And really, at the end of it, the goal is for you to create a cyber resume where you can compare your hard and soft skills to those successful cyber professionals at the agency. So, and last thing, when talking about retaining that special talent, they need to see the progression. They need to see where it's going to go, not just after 2 or 3 or 5 years, but what this can ultimately become for them. So you've got to cultivate that talent.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Mr. Powler.
When we were talking about whether we'd show those videos, I was pretty much against showing the CyberStart video because it was very promotional. And then the guy who was in it, James Line, came over few days ago for a briefing to the National Security Council and OMB and the seniors of the FBI and Cindy, and he blew all of us away with the data. And there was somebody there who will be sort of the US-UK liaison for cyber for the next few years, and he said, I just got briefed by the Brits, and it's true. So I said, okay, show that. And I put at the top of this card on the side that says Cyber Discovery, those first two columns are a game changer. I want to just take a look at the first two columns. They were looking in the first, let me just do with a they. This is a $25 million program, and their goal was to find 600 elite talent. They were willing to spend $25 million for 600 people. So this isn't, and what they mean by elite, you've been hearing, but I'll just give you a definition. If you want to know if your people are elite, stick them in front of a machine that's been infected, have them find the infection and get it out. That's all. It's easy, right? Anybody can do that. I'm a cyber guy. You know how many your people can do that. So, yeah, it's really hard, and there are lots of other jobs like that, but it's a very simple way to say, how many elite people do you have? So they were looking for 150 a year in elite people. They got 900 in the first 8 months because of that game. That's just a game changer. And they're committed to 3,000 a year for the next 3 years. So it's 1,000 this year, 3,000 next year. And the reason that made me show you let you do the video was that they're not doing it in the UK, they're doing it in England. So it's 53 million people. And if you do roughly, we're 6 times as big. And if you extend those numbers to the US, you change the game. Now you can say it won't work, and that's why I put all the rest of the stuff on here, because it'll take your breath away. That kid in the UK, that guy who's 32 going on 14, who you saw in the video, he puts out something that's just, I'll just read you one, which is from a school teacher who says, my girls thought it was way too hard for them, so I had them, I said, just try it. And some of them found out they were good at puzzles. They found out they liked programming. Now I've got them asking the counselors about computer science degrees. Just try it. And if you hear him talking, he said to the seniors, he said, a whole bunch of these people had no idea they were any good at it. No idea. It wasn't that they thought they were good at it and they were trying to see how good they were. That's the people we'll find anyway, right? Yeah. It's the people who, I call her Jenny in French class. She's just amazing at this, but no one would ever show her a chance to do it. So what I think the game changer is right now we have a bad problem. I'm going to define it, and I'm going to give you some data because I think it's useful in meetings when you go to people who aren't helping you. And there are a lot of people who will not help you because they've got some other reason to be in the meeting with you. But if we can change the numbers so that we're not competing for the 1,800, which is the number that Ed Giorgio and I came up with when he was the chief cryptographer at NSA. And that's how many of those high-end people we have. And the high-end, the super elite, are not the people who can find it. They're the people who can actually build the tools to help the other people find it. So they understand at a level beyond just finding the right tools, and they can actually craft the new weaponry for this. So let me just define the problem in a way that might be useful to you. The guy who sort of did it to me was McCullough, who was the 10th Fleet, the first guy who ran the 10th Fleet. Says, so we dominate in kinetic weapons. We're good at kinetic weapons. The other side is outspending us 4-1 in taking command and control of our weapons. If we don't change that fast, we're in deep trouble. If you don't control your weapon systems, it's really hard to fight. And that's where those elite people work. The elite, this is the opposite of the people who write certification and accreditation reports. If you want to know sort of the two ends of the spectrum, there's people who can admire the problem, and there are people who can fix the problem, and we got to find more people who can fix the problem. So let me give you the numbers on the elite. First time I got it, I was having dinner with he was the chief of naval operations, Gary Roughhead. So he says, so Keith sends me this command to give him 3,300 cyber warriors. The Army had to get the same thing. I said, what'd you tell him? He said, I laughed. He said, I don't think we have 300, and if I really were looking, I think I'd find 30. I'm just trying to give you numbers. I mean, that was a long time ago, and it's all fixed now. So that was the first time I got a number like that. The second number, was the Ed Giorgio number. That chart, which every one of the seniors asked for, showed how many people we had who were the policy people, how many people were the journeymen, the ones who can do cybersecurity tasks, and then how many were these elite people who can actually find the bad stuff in your systems. And the bottom line was we have too many at the policy level, taking a lot of time up, who can't solve the problem, but we're not going to fix that one. That's the hard one we talk about all the time. But if we can get more in that elite thing, and his was 1,800 out of 100,000. So he thought we had about 2% of the cybersecurity people in the military defense establishment that were good. But the one that actually, well, two more. I guess I got to quit in a second. But the guy who I'll do the last one when Admiral who's your Mike McConnell, and Admiral McConnell and I were talking, and we were working out how many of those he had. It was 1 in 28. Of the people that they have in cyber, his number was 1 in 28, and he says, all those are the fort. I got to put them at the fort, because if I don't put them at the fort. So this is the world we live in, and I think the CyberStart thing changes the game, and what we're doing with it is every community college kid in Maryland, every historically black college kid in Maryland gets free access to the game, free access to the course that fills in all the gaps you have. And then if they're good enough, about 20 organizations, I'm hoping ManTech and Booz Allen will help with this, about 20 organizations will interview them, and if they are good enough as people they might want to look at, then we have $2 million of Maryland money to give them scholarships to take advanced courses. And those are the same courses that the guys were talking about, that success video. So, and we have a 91% placement rate within 6 months on that program. So we think if we get this right, we can actually start feeding through a pipeline that doesn't have a limit on it. If we can get all the kids to try and we start moving, we can fix that. Sorry about the overtime. Go.
Thank you, Alan. No problem. So we'll turn next, I guess, to Mr. Petit.
There we go. So every organization's going to be hacked or will be hacked or has been hacked at some point in time. In fact, it happened to Booz Allen, right? We were in the news in a big way for a little while several years ago. What that did for us is it told us that this low-density, high-demand skill set needed to be connected. In order for us to be able to respond effectively to this hack, we had to find our sharpest talent, deploy them on our own networks, mitigate the threat that was on our networks, and then set us up for long-term success. And that started us on a road, a journey really, around how we had to do talent management for our cyber force at Booz Allen. Several comments have been made here about unemployment rates being near zero. In fact, ISC squared workforce studies show that in just 4 years, we'll see a shortage of 1.5 to 2 million cybersecurity professionals in just 4 years. And the fact that we are, in fact, competing for some of this same talent, we're going to need to do some of the things that General Fogarty and General Crawford talked about in terms of developing interdependent forces. And DoD started to go down this road already by standardizing the taxonomy around how we define the talent. Booz Allen did the exact same thing. We defined our cyber work roles much like the Defense Cyber Workforce Framework did, the NICE framework at DHS, so that when we ask for a cyber threat analyst, we know what skill set the individual will come with. And if the Army needs to deploy a CPT across its enterprise, and perhaps it got to a point where it needs surge support, perhaps from another service, they know what the other service could offer up because we've standardized around the taxonomy on what it takes to be a cyber professional. So I think that's certainly a key step. Take a drive up the Dulles Tollway. You can see Walmart Technology. You can see Amazon Web Services. There's talk of Amazon Headquarters 2 moving into the area. What you don't see is a lot of the financial institutions and health technology firms that have moved in here and in Central Maryland. And what are they doing? They're looking for cybersecurity talent. Colleague I worked with several years ago in Hawaii was a CMF team lead, left government service, and is now leading as a CISO in a health company in New Jersey. So we are competing, I think, in ways. But the ultimate end goal, right, is national defense. And I think for our own individual interest, our own individual ethics, individuals are getting involved in national defense in different ways. And I'll just go back and say it's going to require interdependence. And within Booz Allen, again, what we did is, like Brett talked about, we started to create deployable teams, because what we found is that the staff members do want to solve hard problems. They want to get different experiences. So the ability to go from a highly classified environment where they're working in a skiff, unable to reach out to their friends on a daily basis, offering them an opportunity to go be on an incident response team with a Fortune 100 company, having their highly classified government client agree that they can go do this and maintain their clearance while they do this, is good for both industry and the Department of Defense. As Brett said, it allows us to bring industry best practices, commercial best practices back into government, and the government does not end up losing the talent of some of these elite cyber professionals, those cyber ninjas. We find that these staff, they have a curiosity, a desire to learn. I always hear that, hey, we want people that are persistent, but I will say we need to be careful about how we assess. Look in this room and look at the diversity in this room, or I'd say the lack of diversity in this room. 1/3 of the cybersecurity professionals come from outside the IT and the engineering field. 1/3. If you go on your LinkedIn profile, how diverse is your connection group on your LinkedIn profile? Have you reached out to folks beyond the cybersecurity field? In order to fill this gap, in order to get the right talent, remember, 1/3 from outside of IT and engineering. In order to find that third, we need to connect more broadly with those in our own professional networks, and our recruiting infrastructure needs to do the same. So these relationships within the university system in Maryland with HBCUs, junior colleges, other non-traditional forms of recruiting are the things we need to do to make up for this talent shortfall. The Army started with signal and MI soldiers, leveraging off the soft communities approach to going camp, post, and station to go find future soft warriors. The Army can do the same thing through capture the flag recruiting events to find talent with the aptitude, the critical thinking skills, and the analytical thinking skills to solve these difficult problems. Thanks.
Thanks, Tim. And next we'll go to Jarrell Menendez.
Wow. It's great to be last. General Hamser, AUSA, thank you for the opportunity here. Great day. Look forward to the continued discussion. Also, having stood up Army Cyber Command, this is now my opportunity to be a revisionist historian. And I go back to my artillery roots and say it looked good when I left. So, Al, thanks for that intro. Remember, everything that they say about us is all self-proclaimed. And I'd argue a little bit, JP, that there is room in cyber talent management to leverage those self-proclaimed skills by individuals in a way that can be trusted but verified. And having commanded HRC, I think there's great opportunity for us to increase our talent management that way. I also argue and agree with you, JP, that changing the culture is the hardest thing that I ever had to do several times. And now as in the cybersecurity business, Almost every company I go to that has something to do with cybersecurity tells me that their first priority is to not lose the culture they have. And in a way, we're trying to figure out how to change the culture, and they recognize the significance of needing to keep the culture. I'm going to give it a little different view because I can't talk to the examples that were given here, but I'd like to not focus on recruit and retain, but a few things to consider that might inform your recruit and retain. And I'll do that through short stories that impacted me, and then with time I'll put a little bit of meat on the bones of those. The first one is 20 years ago, former battalion commander on OPMS 21 Task Force. And at the time, the intent was to enhance our warfighting capability, but more importantly, define what skills the Army would need for the 21st century, and how we could increase both breadth and depth across the force. We created at the time 9 new functional areas. It was not free. It was at the cost of former battalion commanders not making colonel. But we certainly increased our warfighting capability. We increased our depth and breadth and skills that we did not have before. And today we are producing not only general officers in each of those areas, but we have a deeper bench than we had before. I say that story because I see parallels in where we are today with respect to what should that cyber force be, and that it is pretty painful to think your way through not recruit and retain only, but what's the right development path that's going to allow you to grow those skill sets and realize it takes a generation to grow them. It's not that it's going to immediately wake up with it, put a big investment over a long period of time. I also believe that over time we recognize it's going to become more multidisciplined. So it was great to hear Steve talk about convergence, because we were talking about convergence of IO, EW, cyber. We also talk about convergence over time of Dick, space. You and I had this conversation, and fires. Right, so there's a lot of convergence coming on, but I broaden it more now today because I think it's more multidisciplined. We need to think our way through what that means with respect to policy, legal, how we grow those skills, what we might need with respect to behavioral scientists as we get deeper into information operations, for example. My second story is 2004. I'm at HRC, and General Schumacher comes over, and he says to me this quote. This is true. Hey, Hernandez, the Army is too big for even you to break. Pretty encouraging as he put me in charge of Human Resources Command, but it really forced us to think differently in order to meet the demands of an Army at war that was rotating at 1-to-1 in many places, didn't have skills. We were growing modularity. We had an unbelievable growth in majors and field grades, and we had an out-of-balance priority list. Yet we had a sense of urgency that we needed to get on with growing the Army and transforming the personnel system to meet the demands of an Army at war. I believe that there are many parallels today with cyberspace, and those demands are growing, and I encourage our continued ways to think differently, particularly since they are now informed by operations and have been informed by operations for the last 18 months, so we can stop arguing about what we think it is and we can see what it in many ways has become. These two examples talk to me most about the idea of us not only figuring out what skills we want to invest in, but how we get the right mix and distribution. And by mix, when we stood up Cyber Command and Army Cyber Command, we said we're going to grow a professional cyber force first, military focused, and then we'll work our way through what's the mix, active guard and reserve, and then we'll think our way through what's the right distribution of military, civilians, and contractors. I believe we're at that point where we need to start thinking our way through, informed by ops, how do we get the right mix and how do we get the right distribution, because you all know that that we can't grow all these skills, and we don't even know what they all are yet. I would also argue that when we stood up a 39-person CPT, the only thing we knew is it was wrong. And we said if we move out now, we can figure out how to adjust. I think we're at that point where we can now start working our way through adjust, but it's not only in the skills, it's also in the organizations. I think General Fogarty is going to have to wrestle with, does it make sense to have a defensive brigade and an offensive brigade? Are there task organized units? It starts to impact how you decide to organize with respect to what skills you're going to have, what that mix and distribution is going to be, but also with respect to how it is you develop them. And in my view, the development is the key between retain and recruit, and probably most significant to me for develop is that we need to think hard about, does our progressive and sequential professional development system apply? And I believe it does, but it also needs to change. And how does it need to change? Most significantly to me is we need to think about a new convergence, and the convergence is training, education, and experience. And we always did training, education, experience in progressive and sequential ways. We know that with the people that we have on continuous missions, they also need to do continuous training. When I commanded a service battery, I took them off the range, I closed the mess hall down, and I got called, why'd you close the mess hall down? Because we have to fire our weapons. Today, we can't afford to take them off the mission, but we have to take them off so that they can continue to hone their skills and train, so they can bring in new tools and capabilities, and most importantly, so they can rehearse for the next mission they're going on. And the schoolhouse needs to adjust in a way that when you have a problem tonight, you want to wake up tomorrow with the solution. And they're going to call their posse for a solution, or they're going to go someplace where they can get that solution. And as you all know, experience demands more reps. So bringing those together, I think, is critical to our work. The last story I'll tell is in 2010, when I stood up Army Cyber Command, we recognized skills and competence was the coin of the realm. General Alexander said, stand up national mission teams. I looked at General Buckner and said, stand up as many as you can. She said, but they're going to be out of balance. And I said, just fill them with skills first, worry about grades later. We filled the first 2 national mission teams, and at the end we said we're probably about 80% grade skill mismatch. From an Army standpoint, we would have failed, but from a mission standpoint, we were off and running. So my comment here is, if competence is the coin of the realm and grade is not the critical piece, then getting mix and distribution is probably more important. So we should be asking the question, how does a requirement-based system apply to a cyber force? And I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, sir. We had some great questions coming in while the panel were making their comments, and then there's a little bit of a theme that's come together here. So some of your questions, I'm going to amalgamate them a little because there's some overlap in some of them that hit the table here. But one intrigued me in particular that we haven't touched on, and that is how do you, and General McGee mentioned the in-stride, how do we do this in-stride, General Hernandez, I think all the panel members sort of touched on that in one way or another. But this is an intriguing question to me, is how do we take and empower and educate current Army leaders who will lead this cyber force for the skills that they need to motivate, manage, develop the folks that are being recruited or that are being brought in. So we have our current sort of established skill sets as leaders in the Army. Those leaders need to be challenged and developed in ways also that makes them effective as we bring in the new talent. So over to no particular person, but Alan, please.
I have one tiny story about that. I served for 7 years on the Air Force Institute of Technology Oversight Board, and they, in their wisdom, decided they were going to train the majors and the colonels. So the 2 classes, a 200 class for the majors and a 300 class for the colonels. And I happened to be at a meeting of the advisory board when they were having their class, and I was in the lunchroom with them, and I asked questions. So I went over and sat down with them. So how do you like it? And to a person, they hated it. I don't mean they didn't like it. I mean they felt trapped by these academics talking about cybersecurity. And I thought, oh, it's really bad. And then one guy said, but there was one cool thing that happened. They showed us how an attack actually worked. And then we could ask questions about that. And everybody said, oh yeah, that was good, that was worth coming. So the FBI is trying to do this for all their seniors. And they sort of are going to skip the academic thing. And they're doing a set of very, very cool scenarios of how actual attacks worked. And inside those things, there's little teaching going on, meaning you might learn DNS, you might learn some other language that just so you can have a conversation with the techies. But it's for the colonels, and don't. Well, all I'm saying is don't send them to class for any of our classes. Just don't do it to those poor people.
So I'll just throw two thoughts out there, because I think it's bigger than cyber. But if we imagine a future that is increasingly defined by this rapid technological change, not just in cyber but in other ones, I mean, how do you educate leaders to be able to at least help manage those people who understand that uniquely, and then employ those talents to accomplish your mission? I think increasingly that's got to be a skill set we develop in our leaders as they start progressing up towards senior leaders, because I think it's not going to be possible to expect to have every senior leader to have a deep depth of technical talent, although maybe in some positions you'll want to have that. But how do you then have these leaders who have much broader general knowledges, and then how have we trained them to take expertise in narrow areas and deploy that? And I'm not sure that there's a whole lot of attention given to that in our development right now of strategic leaders. And so that's one. And then just specifically General Fogarty, I mean, everyone has said this before, but the network is a weapons platform. And so most maneuver leaders understand the weapons platforms that they're employing. They understand the limitations and constraints and how an Apache is employed, or an Abrams tank, or any of those things. I'm not sure if we've dedicated enough time and effort to make maneuver leaders understand exactly what they have with their network. And so I think that's driven a significant number of problems, because the network is not theirs, it's their S6s to manage. And look, I mean, I am guilty of this, and generally when I speak to a group of officers, I start off by apologizing to any signal officers in the room, because I think I've created part of this problem where most maneuver commanders' answer to the network is S6, G6, J6, make this thing better, fix it, without an understanding of why it is complicated, and not really fully understanding that, and that desire to just make your stuff work, you may be actually putting yourself at risk of losing that weapon system, that network, because what you're encouraging them to do is operate that network at a much less defended level than you would ever actually accept if you understood it. And so I think at the basis of this, you've got leaders who have grown up with this but haven't been fully trained in how to understand a network, how to fight a network, and then really how to maximally employ and give guidance to their S6s, G6s, J6s, so that they can make wise decisions and give good guidance. And I think that's part of the development that we need to go forward with.
Yeah, I would just add that I think the tremendous work that you've done at the CTCs is starting to inform that. And now it's important to get it into PME. So there's two sides of the coin. One side is what do the cyber experts need to know, and the other side, what does everybody else need to know from a maneuver standpoint. But making progress, still a ways to go.
Just one vignette. So I went from being a PM where I was fielding things that I knew I had waivers for an authority to operate, to being Chief of Staff, U.S. Force Afghanistan, and going through the first command cyber readiness inspection in Afghanistan. So I got to pay for those sins big time, okay? Yes, sir, you did. We passed, but I was well aware of where the issues were. And a lot of those came from PMs. Some of them came from decisions we made from an operational level. But I think rather than, as Mr. Paller said, rather than put senior leaders in a class, it's got to be vignette-driven. It's got to be case-driven. It's got to be, I'm learning from the School of Hard Knocks. And then what do I have to know to be more effective on a leader? What do I have to know technically? I don't have to be a Python programmer. I don't. But I should probably understand what Python programmers do and how it can help me and where they're effective. And so I fully agree. But I think that course, that part of War College and that part of what we're going to put into our officer professional development, I think is a work in progress. Right now, we're just learning in the School of Hard Knocks.
Thank you. So I'm particularly intrigued about, we all nod wisely and sagely when we say new skills will be required, new attributes. Well, I'm going to put the panel on the spot here and ask you, what are those qualities, skills, attributes that we're going to be looking for in our cyber warriors, and how do we identify them? And the other theme of all of the questions, frankly, has been once you've identified them, how do you effectively recruit and retain them? And we've touched on that just a little bit. I know that's a wide open and broad question I just asked, but let's back to the specifics. What are those skills and attributes and competencies that we need in our cyber workforce going forward?
So I think certainly for us at Booz Allen, one of the big things is curiosity. What we find is common among individuals that are successful in this piece of the business is they love to learn. They like to solve hard problems, and they like to mentor others in solving hard problems. I'd say also that they need to be able to think bigger than their individual task. They need to be able to work in a systems environment to see how what they do will affect the larger operational capability. And I think this is going to be the difficult part, because we really want people that are critical thinkers, that challenge the assumptions made in a problem, to be the devil's advocate, and then be analytical and connect dots to solve problems. But I'll tell you that the hiring managers are looking for those things, but the talent, they place their priority on the technical skill, and they're not looking for that soft skill, the analytical skill. So they're really focused in on that technology piece. So we need to be able to assess the talent in the upfront process to identify those that have the deep technical skills, that have the capacity to actually improve on their analytical and critical thinking skills. And I think that's where we'll gain the most success.
I couldn't agree more. I know that when it comes to our front-end assessment and selection technology, those areas that you just referenced are critical to the success of those candidates that we do bring on board. This personality assessments, really key. You're right. They want to do the technological aspect of it. I can't agree more. With actually the first line of suggestions, thoughts you had, I thought were, as far as the diversification, I probably wouldn't be permitted in here to recruit just based upon the diversity of this audience right now. It really is. It's a fact. I mean, it's something it's critical that we take very seriously, and we diversify our approach to accommodate that demand.
And I'd say, just to add, right, on the diversity front, I've sat through capture the flag exercises with individuals, and the way men solve problems and the way women solve problems is different.
Yeah.
You'll have a male participant hammering their head against a single problem until they move it along, and I've had women participants open up several problems and bounce between them. And I think the interaction of individuals that work in this environment, sharing how they solve problems, their thought processes, is good for the whole.
Yeah.
And because they like to learn from each other, I think our solutions will be better. So again, back to the diversity piece, history majors.
Not just ethnic diversity. We're talking about diversity of thought, backgrounds. Like, I would say that many of the institutions that we target have very rich socioeconomic diversity, disparity. That's something that's today very measurable. We use a lot of data analysis to determine that. So a school like Stanford, for instance, General, is very high up in that regard, where they're going to provide grant and aid funds to low-income students. We target those heavily. So,
100% right, but missing an equally important dimension. And it's why we actually have the ability now to find adults who will excel in this field but they're missing a dimension unless we can find it. And with the kids, we actually find it directly, and that's tenacity. So curiosity and no tenacity is obnoxious. So, because they need to stay until the job is done. And what this game does is, and you'll see it in the quotes from the teachers, it finds kids who will simply stick to it until they're done. One of the quotes was, it was the first 2 days of their vacation, a Saturday and a Sunday, and they wouldn't let me go on vacation because they wanted to stay in school and continue to play the game so they could learn more. There's a tenacity thing that you separate on in the first 30 minutes. So, I mean, a whole lot of people, I think about 90%, are not either curious enough or tenacious enough. At least they're not both. And they just sort of quit. And that's great, because then you can actually invest in the people who do. The other thing that I love about an online game, rather than the way we normally go after people, is you had to kill yourself to go to all those different schools and develop all those relationships. Kill yourself's wrong, but spend a lot of resources to go to all those schools and send people out. The online game looks like it finds the rural kids just as well as it finds the urban kids. It looks like it finds the poor kids just as, and what's the rural kids are missing and the poor kids are missing are teachers who would identify them. In the urban systems, we have people who are on the lookout. They might work, their husbands or wives might work in the field. Out in the middle of sort of southwestern, well, outside of Blacksburg, sure. you just don't find them. Anyway, I think tenacity matters just as much as curiosity.
Sir?
So I think, Alan, I agree with everything there for sure. My words are propensity and intensity. Propensity for this field and an intensity for it. It's not just because, that'd be cool to do. It's that you really can do it and you have the intensity to do it. Just a separate comment, but related to this, a little more specific. I think I would be thinking about what's needed 10 years from now and just set the base that says we know that the adversary is moving to increased automation. So in some way, that's a different set of skill sets that we're going to need. And it's also a way of thinking that we can't train ourselves out of the current problem because we're going to have a new problem. How do you deal with a threat that's increasingly automating everything that they do? So I would start thinking about who should be doing big data analytics, more importantly, algorithms for artificial intelligence. How do you drive this machine learning and recognize that those are skill sets that we either invest in through growing them or we contract for them. But in many ways, we're behind that fight already. So I think tool developers, I don't think they're going away. I think we get better at them, but some of these others tied to increased automated threat is critical to think about.
I would just agree with that. I know that high performance computing and AI data science continues to expand exponentially. So totally agree with you on that.
Just one other skill. We've got an advanced cyber training program that we run that we teach. It's basically a cyber ranger school. We bring in government customers. We have our folks from ManTech that also are in mission support that go through that course. So we find that they need to be successful. They're problem solvers. They're tenacious. What we'd also find is after they leave the course, they have to be team players. And I think that's true of Ranger. That's that Ranger school mentality that you're not going to do these things on your own. In order to accomplish many of these missions successfully in cyberspace, it is a team of individuals that have to come together to solve that problem. So that ability to team, that ability to work with others in long hours, difficult situations under stress, really mirrors some of the things we've done to train our combat leaders.
So we've got about 2 minutes left, and I'm going to touch on just a couple of comments that were here as we wrap up for the last response. So we'll have to be pithy in our feedback here. But to mix what General Hernandez, you mentioned earlier about what is the right mix between contractors, government, and so forth. And then we've talked about, as we deal with the tyranny of the urgent, how do we take into account the advances in machine learning and AI that will in some ways replace that workforce that we're developing right now, where they become the leaders of the organization, employing those new advancing tools that are coming at us at an accelerated rate. So if I could so we have a question of what is the right mix now, but using that in the sense of setting the conditions for the future force, where we know, then we also mentioned about running, DR8s and crank phones here earlier. The people that we are bringing in now will be the ones that have to deal with the new technology 30 years from now. So how do we balance those things with that mix, I guess, is the question. So.
I'd say some of the early things with AI, it was mentioned earlier in the acquisition panel, we can already employ automation and orchestration capabilities to really take care of some of the manual processes that are inherent in DoD cybersecurity right now. And in doing so, we're not actually going to replace that workforce. What we're going to do is we're going to allow that workforce to focus on deeper analysis on prioritized threats rather than having to weed through the mundane, the manual things that are already there. So I think what it's going to do, it's going to free the workforce up from some of the rudimentary tasks that they have to hone, copy and pasting out of Excel worksheets and into other data forms. And it's going to allow them to actually employ their critical thinking skills and analyze fused information much more rapidly, and we'll be able to address more threats more quickly that way. So I think that's the initial play. It's just going to refocus skills they have.
Any others? No? All right, what I'd like to do is give General McGee the floor here just for the last, well, we are over 30 seconds, so you have to do this in some time-forward way, but over to you.
So I think, great discussion by everybody. Appreciate everyone's participation. I mean, it's a unique challenge. I tend to think that it's not a question of competition with industry. It's how do we partner better with industry. I think, I don't think we're actually in competition with Google and hiring that talent, but if we hired, Google probably gets 1,000 applications every day for just a very few number. If we could siphon off the next 10 people on that list they didn't hire, I think we would be dramatically better. And so I tend to think this is more about collaboration than competition. I think part of the challenge is going forward, not just within cyber and others, is how do we employ the strength of our nation in all these technical fields to better enable our Army. I think personally that if we say that the future for robotics for the Army, that person who's going to lead us in the future needed to be commissioned 25 years ago, I think we may be missing the mark in terms of being adaptive enough to bring in the talents of the nation to help drive us. And my experience is I think there's a greater appetite for people who are out there to contribute to their nation and their nation's defense than sometimes we realize. And I think that's part of the challenges going forward is how do we do this not just within cyber, but as General Fogarty talks about, in this greater information warfare realm and probably some other technical ones as well.
Thanks, sir. Thanks, sir.
Thanks for a great talk.